The state autopsy of Nolan Wells is now complete, but the results are not yet public just yet. So according to News Nation, the results will remain sealed until the autopsy is presented to a grand jury, which will then determine whether a crime occurred. The 18-year-old was found dead following a boating trip with friends over the 4th of July weekend.
The official autopsy is finished. The report exists. It has been signed, completed, and handed to prosecutors, and the public still doesn't know what it says. Two separate medical examinations, one commissioned by Nolan Wells' family, one conducted by the state of Mississippi, have now both concluded. And somehow, after all of that, we still don't have a confirmed cause of death, a confirmed manner of death, or an official explanation for how an 18-year-old boy ended up dead on a Mississippi barrier island after a 4th of July boat trip. That's where we start today, not with his disappearance, not with the search. You already know that part if you've been with us. What you don't know yet is what's happened since, and there is a lot. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because this case has been moving fast, and we're about to catch you up. For everyone else, let's get into it. Here's the essential version for anyone who needs it. Nolan Wells was 18. On July 4th, he traveled with a group of friends to Horn Island, an uninhabited stretch of federally protected coastline off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. He was last seen there in the afternoon. His friend's boat left without him. 2 days later, on July 6th, his body was recovered on the island's shoreline. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office opened a death investigation. And within days, Nolan's parents, Christine Wonsley and Elmore Wonsley, said publicly that the early explanation they were being given didn't add up. That's what led them to commission a second, independent autopsy, separate from the one the state had already performed. We covered all of that in detail in our last video. This one picks up from there. Independent autopsy was performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell, president of the National Medical Association, with funding from former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick's Know Your Rights Camp initiative, which has supported independent examinations in other cases involving Black Americans who died under disputed circumstances. On July 22nd, at the NAACP's National Convention in Chicago, attorney Ben Crump announced the results, reading directly from Mitchell's report. The conclusion: cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending further investigation. Undetermined isn't a shrug. It's a specific finding, one pathologists use when the evidence in front of them genuinely isn't enough to support any of the standard categories: natural, accidental, suicide, or homicide. It's not a finding of foul play. It's also not a finding against it. What made this particular exam so limited comes down to two things. First, decomposition. The body had already spent time in warm coastal water and more time in transit before Mitchell ever examined it, which erodes exactly the kind of soft tissue evidence a pathologist relies on. Second, something more specific. Mitchell's report states that the state of Mississippi had already retained key internal structures from Wells' neck, including his trachea and hyoid bone, as part of its own autopsy. Without those, Mitchell said he could not directly examine the airway or lungs for water or the stomach for contents, and could not rule out an injury to the neck as a contributing factor. He did find one thing the state's original exam hadn't documented: a red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Wells' head, in the occipital region, roughly 12 by 8 inches. No skull fracture, no skin laceration, no definitive explanation. Mitchell called it significant enough to warrant further investigation and noted it couldn't have been seen during the original autopsy because that area hadn't been dissected the first time around. So that's where the last video left off. Two competing but incomplete pictures, and an official autopsy at that point still not finished. It's finished now. Multiple outlets, including NBC News, confirmed in the first days of August that the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office had completed its autopsy, along with toxicology testing. The findings were turned over to Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McIlrath, and they will not be released publicly. Instead, they're headed to a grand jury. McIlrath's office has been clear about why. In a recorded statement, she explained that this isn't special treatment for this case. Every death in the county, except those of natural causes and non-criminal car wrecks, is presented to your grand jury. A grand jury doesn't decide guilt. Its job is narrower, to review the evidence prosecutors have gathered and decide whether it supports formal charges at all. Sealing an autopsy until that review happens is standard procedure in Mississippi, not a signal that officials suspect a crime occurred here specifically. Still, the report is complete, toxicology is complete, and none of it is public, which means the single most direct answer to how Nolan Wells died currently exists in exactly one place, a sealed file waiting on a hearing with no announced date. While that report sat sealed, a separate, privately commissioned investigation was quietly working through a different kind of evidence entirely. On August 3rd, a 22-page analytical review was completed, examining photographs, videos, GPS coordinates, and witness accounts from July 4th, an attempt to reconstruct, second by second if possible, where every boat and every person actually was that afternoon. This wasn't a medical exam. It was a digital and physical reconstruction. And its central conclusion was this: there is a material gap in the timeline, specifically between the last independently corroborated sighting of Nolan Wells and the reported departure time of the boat that had brought him to the island. That gap matters because it sits at the exact center of the mystery, not what happened in the water, what happened or didn't happen in the minutes before anyone realized he wasn't with them. The review is careful not to fill that gap with speculation. What it does instead is list, precisely, what still needs independent verification: authenticated video metadata, verified vessel GPS records, a complete accounting of who was on which boat and when, and additional witness statements. It also flags something worth understanding on its own. Boat identifications in photographs circulating online are often just labels added by whoever posted them, not confirmed by anyone with access to registration records. And timestamps on social media video can't be trusted at face value without the original file and its underlying metadata, because that data can be altered or simply wrong, depending on how and where a video was recorded and shared. We saw exactly this problem play out in real time during our last coverage of this case, when a video attributed to Wells' final hours sparked a dispute over whose voice was actually on it, a dispute that was never fully resolved publicly. That's the digital evidence problem in miniature. Plenty of raw material online, very little of it verified to a standard that actually answers anything. There's also a detail worth sitting with that hasn't gotten much attention until recently. According to reporting on the investigation's unresolved threads, Nolan's phone was reportedly in the possession of someone else at the time he went missing. Why, and what that means for reconstructing his final movements, has not been publicly explained. Investigators have also subpoenaed social media accounts connected to the day, part of the broader effort to pin down what actual digital evidence, as opposed to what's circulating online, can establish. Beyond the digital trail, several other forensic threads remain active. Crump's legal team has said forensic audio specialists are reviewing the complete sea tow emergency call placed from the water that day, an effort to understand exactly what was communicated and when, during whatever emergency prompted that call. Separately, ocean engineering experts have been asked to examine tidal patterns for July 4th and 5th, specifically whether the location where Wells' body was ultimately recovered, near the island's northwestern tip, is consistent with how the water was moving at the time. Attorney Eric Hertz has said discussions are underway about a joint forensic examination of cell phones connected to the case, one he expects would likely involve the FBI if it moves forward. And the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, which is leading the investigation, has said it's receiving assistance from the FBI more broadly, though the scope of that involvement hasn't been detailed publicly. Each of these threads is trying to answer a narrow, specific question: the audio review, what exactly was said during that emergency call; the tidal analysis, does the recovery location match the physical conditions that day or complicate them; the cell phone examination, what do the devices themselves show about who was where and when; None of them, on their own, closes the case. Together, they're the shape of an investigation still actively trying to reconstruct ours that, as of now, nobody outside a small circle of investigators can fully account for. Not every development in the past few weeks has been about evidence. Some of it has been about misinformation and its consequences. In early August, a document began circulating on social media claiming to be Nolan Wells' toxicology report. It wasn't. Mississippi's Public Safety Commissioner, Sean Tindell, issued a public statement calling it fraudulent, saying the purported toxicology report from Nolan Wells circulating through social media on various outlets is fraudulent, and adding that Nolan's family, friends, and most importantly, Nolan himself, deserve better. To be clear, no official toxicology results from either autopsy have been made public in any form as of this recording. If you see one online, it isn't real. That kind of misinformation didn't stay online. It escalated into federal charges against 3 people, none of whom had any connection to Wells, his family, or the friends who were with him on July 4th. Joseph Alfredo Vasquez Dumas of Sacramento, California, was indicted by a federal grand jury and arrested on July 30th, accused of sending a violent, threatening message to Jackson County Chancery Judge Ashley Cole. That connection matters because Judge Cole's stepson, Warren Hudson, was one of the friends who traveled with Wells to Horn Island that day, and one of 3 friends whose families say they've faced sustained online harassment since. The next day, Michelle Francine Edwards of Ohio was arrested and accused of calling in a false bomb threat to the George County Chancery Clerk's office and the Jackson County Sheriff's office, a threat serious enough that the building was placed on lockdown while bomb-sniffing dogs searched the property. And on August 4th, Edward James Porter of Illinois was arrested and accused of making threatening calls to 2 witnesses connected to the investigation. Prosecutors have said none of the 3 defendants appear to know Wells, his family, or the group of friends who were with him, which makes these charges a different kind of story entirely, not evidence about how Nolan Wells died, but a measure of how much anger, speculation, and pressure this case has generated online. Pressure severe enough that people with no actual connection to it were, according to federal prosecutors, willing to threaten violence over it. It's also worth being honest about part of why this case generated that kind of intensity in the first place. Nolan Wells was black. The friends he traveled with that day were white. National civil rights figures, including the Reverend Al Sharpton, have said publicly that Mississippi's history makes that detail impossible to simply set aside, while also cautioning against assuming it explains what happened. Crump's team has said the family wants transparency, not bias either way, just answers. In Sharpton's words from Wells' funeral, authorities have not addressed the question of race directly in their public statements. It remains part of the context surrounding this case, not a conclusion about it. There's one more tension worth naming clearly, because it doesn't get resolved by anything we've covered so far. Early in the investigation, Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter said publicly that investigators did not suspect foul play. As of August 2nd, officials reaffirmed that position, saying they still hadn't identified foul play, while stressing that the investigation remains active. That statement sits somewhat uneasily next to an independent pathologist who says he can't rule out non-accidental factors, and an official autopsy that so far hasn't said anything publicly at all. Both things can be true: an early working assessment from investigators and a formally undetermined finding from a forensic pathologist, without one having proven the other wrong. But it's exactly the kind of gap that explains why so many people are still asking questions. So here's what still doesn't add up, stated plainly, without filling in the blanks ourselves. There is still no public cause or manner of death from either autopsy, despite both being complete. There is still a material, unexplained gap in the timeline between Wells' last corroborated sighting and his friend's departure from the island, one that a dedicated 22-page review could not close. There is still no explanation for the red discoloration on the back of Wells' head, only 2 competing possibilities: decomposition or injury, neither confirmed. There is still no public account of why Wells' phone was reportedly in someone else's possession when he went missing. There is still a direct tension between the sheriff's early and continued statement that foul play isn't suspected, and the independent pathologist's statement that he cannot rule out non-accidental factors. And there is still no announced date for when any of this goes in front of a grand jury. None of these are theories. They're simply the questions that remain open, according to the people closest to the investigation on both sides of it. So where does that leave things as of right now? Confirmed, Nolan Wells' body was recovered July 6th. Both the independent and official autopsies are complete. Toxicology testing tied to the official autopsy is complete. None of those medical findings have been released publicly. The case is headed to a Jackson County grand jury on a timeline that hasn't been announced. A privately commissioned digital and physical evidence review has identified a specific timeline gap without resolving it. Multiple additional forensic threads, audio, tidal, and potentially cell phone data remain active. 3 people with no connection to the case have been federally charged over threats made amid the online response to it. Unresolved, the actual cause and manner of Wells' death, what happened during the timeline gap, what the red discoloration on the back of his head means, what, if anything, toxicology will show once it's public, what the cell phone data and CTO audio ultimately establish, and what a grand jury will eventually decide to do with all of it. Unverified and worth explicitly setting aside, the fraudulent toxicology document Commissioner Tyndall has already debunked, and any other claims circulating online that haven't been confirmed by investigators, the family's legal team, or credible reporting. Christine Wonsley has continued speaking publicly through all of this, and her position hasn't shifted. Recently, she put it simply, "I am asking for answers, that is it, that is all." Crump has echoed that, saying the family's focus remains on getting real answers, not on the parallel civil disputes or online noise that have grown up around the case. "We're not going to tell you what we think happened, because we don't know, and neither, right now, does anyone speaking on the record. What we can tell you is this: 2 medical examinations have now concluded, and the public still doesn't have a confirmed explanation for how Nolan Wells died. A 22-page, near minute-by-minute reconstruction effort still has a gap in it that nobody has closed. And a family that started asking for transparency back in July is still waiting for it in August. If this update helped you make sense of where things actually stand, let us know in the comments and tell us honestly, of everything we just walked through, which unresolved question do you think matters most to how this case ultimately gets answered? Please keep that conversation respectful. This is still someone's son. The investigation is still active. The grand jury hasn't convened. The report is still sealed. We'll be back the moment that changes, with whatever the facts actually show and nothing more than that. If you want to be here when it happens, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.